To save an airline, she must risk everything, even her heart. Rory Gale had always believed that numbers were honest. Numbers did not lie, did not hide motives, and did not pretend to be something they were not. If a structure failed, the calculations showed why. If a company collapsed, the balance sheets had warned about it long before the headlines appeared. But that afternoon, the numbers on the screen in front of her felt wrong. Not mathematically wrong. Worse, they were true. Rory leaned back slowly in the chair in her glass-walled office on the 27th floor of the SkyLink headquarters. Outside the window, Manhattan moved with its usual impatient rhythm, sunlight sliding across glass towers while traffic crawled through the avenues below. Inside the room, there was only the quiet hum of her laptop and the cold weight forming in her chest. $412 million. She checked the spreadsheet again, scrolling through credit lines and interest obligations. The conclusion was brutally simple. SkyLink could survive 2 months on current liquidity, but the numbers were irrelevant compared to the ticking clock in the fine print. A major $350 million balloon payment to their primary creditors was due in exactly 10 days. Without refinancing, the default clause would trigger an immediate, catastrophic collapse of the entire corporate structure. Rory forced her voice to remain steady. And Caleb Galloway knows this. Yes. So the marriage condition isn't symbolic. Arthur shook his head. It's leverage. Rory slowly sat back down in her chair. What happens if I refuse? Arthur answered without hesitation. SkyLink files for bankruptcy before the end of the quarter. The room fell silent again. Rory looked out the window once more, but the skyline felt distant now. So the choice is simple, she said quietly. Arthur waited. I marry a man I've never met. She paused, letting the words settle. Or 3,000 employees lose their jobs, and the company my grandfather built disappears. Arthur did not answer. He did not need to. The numbers had already made the decision brutally clear. The silence in Rory Gale's office lasted longer than either of them expected. Arthur Gale did not rush to fill it. He had spent decades negotiating deals, and he understood that silence often forced the other person to confront the truth faster than arguments ever could. Rory kept her eyes on the skyline of Manhattan, watching sunlight slide slowly across the towers as if the city itself refused to acknowledge that an entire aviation company might disappear within 10 days. Finally, she spoke. When do I meet him? Arthur's shoulders relaxed slightly, the smallest sign of relief. Tomorrow evening. Rory turned her head. That was fast. We don't have time to move slowly. Where? The family estate in the Hamptons. Rory nodded once. Of course it would be somewhere elegant and controlled, somewhere where every photograph would look deliberate if the press ever saw it. And I assume the lawyers will be there. Arthur allowed himself a thin smile. Naturally. Rory stood up from the chair and closed the laptop. The numbers disappeared from the screen, but they remained painfully clear in her mind. $412 million. 10 days. A marriage contract disguised as a corporate solution. Tell me about him, she said. Arthur walked slowly toward the window. Caleb Galloway became CEO of Galloway Corp 4 years ago after his father stepped down. Age? 34. Rory folded her arms slightly. Reputation. Arthur considered the question carefully. Efficient. Controlled. Not particularly friendly. Meaning, he wins negotiations. Rory almost smiled at that. So he's like you. Arthur ignored the comment. Under his leadership, Galloway expanded into several new manufacturing sectors. Their stock has risen steadily until the recent scandal. Rory watched him carefully. What scandal? Arthur hesitated briefly. His younger brother. What about him? Tristan Galloway has a talent for creating headlines. Rory raised an eyebrow. Illegal headlines. Let's say, embarrassing ones. Arthur finally turned back toward her. Which is exactly why the board wants a public symbol of stability. A marriage between the two companies solves several problems at once. Rory walked to the desk again and leaned against it. You negotiated all of this without asking me. Arthur met her gaze calmly. Because I knew you would say no before hearing the full situation. You were right. And yet you're still considering it. Rory did not answer immediately. The truth was obvious. SkyLink was not just a corporation on a balance sheet. It was thousands of engineers, technicians, mechanics, designers, and pilots who had built their lives around the company. Bankruptcy would not only erase a brand, it would erase their work. Do I at least get to meet the man before signing my life away? She asked dryly. Arthur allowed himself a short breath of amusement. Dinner tomorrow evening. Rory nodded once. Fine. Arthur studied her expression, searching for hesitation. Live people who controlled entire industries. 40 minutes later, the car turned through a set of iron gates and followed a long, curved driveway. At the end stood a massive estate overlooking the gray Atlantic water. The house was built from pale stone, wide windows reflecting the fading evening light. It looked less like a home and more like a private resort. Rory stepped out of the car and immediately noticed something else. Another car was already parked near the entrance. Arthur walked out of the house to greet her. Right on time. I assume they're already here. Arthur nodded. Caleb arrived 20 minutes ago. Rory glanced toward the front doors. And his brother. Arthur's expression tightened slightly. Yes. Rory exhaled slowly. Good. Arthur looked surprised. Good. Rory walked toward the entrance. Better to see the entire problem immediately. The doors opened before she reached them. A tall man stepped into the light of the entrance hall. For a moment, Rory knew immediately which one he was without needing an introduction. Caleb Galloway stood with the stillness of someone used to controlling every room he entered. He was taller than she expected, his dark suit perfectly fitted, his expression calm but unreadable. His eyes studied her with the same analytical focus she had used earlier when reviewing SkyLink's financial disaster. Arthur stepped forward. Caleb, this is my daughter Rory. Caleb nodded once. Miss Hale. His voice was low, controlled, almost precise. Rory extended her hand. Mr. Galloway. He shook it briefly. The contact was firm, professional, and ended quickly. No warmth. No unnecessary gestures. Rory understood immediately why investors trusted him. He radiated control. Another voice interrupted the moment. Well, this is charming. Rory turned slightly. A second man leaned casually against the staircase railing inside the hall. Tristan Galloway looked younger, looser, his posture relaxed in a way that felt deliberately provocative. His smile was sharp with amusement. The future merger of two corporations, Tristan said lazily. And it starts with a handshake. Caleb's voice became colder. Tristan. Tristan raised both hands slightly. What? I'm observing history. His eyes moved to Rory with open curiosity. You're prettier than the financial reports suggested. Arthur's expression hardened immediately. Mr. Galloway. Tristan grinned. Relax. We're practically family already. Rory studied him calmly for a second. Then she answered. That depends on whether the asset appreciates or depreciates. Tristan blinked once. Caleb's expression did not change, but Rory noticed something subtle in his eyes. Approval. Tristan laughed softly. Interesting, he said. She speaks in financial terms already. Caleb stepped aside toward the dining room. Dinner is ready. Rory followed Arthur inside, aware that the real negotiation had not even started yet. Behind them, the doors of the estate closed quietly, sealing 4 people inside a house where the future of 2 corporations, and possibly her own life, would be decided. The dining room of the Galloway estate looked less like a place for family dinners and more like a boardroom disguised as luxury. A long dark table stretched across the center of the room beneath a chandelier that cast a controlled golden light over polished wood and crystal glasses. Large windows faced the Atlantic, where evening waves rolled slowly under a gray sky. Rory noticed immediately that there were only 4 seats prepared at the table. No assistants. No lawyers. That would come later. Tonight was about assessment. Caleb Galloway sat at the head of the table, not in a theatrical way, but in the quiet manner of someone accustomed to being there. Arthur took the seat to his right. Rory sat opposite Caleb. Tristan dropped into the last chair with casual indifference, leaning back as if he had wandered into the wrong meeting and decided to stay for entertainment. For the first several minutes, dinner proceeded with polite neutrality. A server poured wine, plates appeared, and the first conversation remained safely superficial. But Rory could feel the tension under the surface like pressure building inside a sealed chamber. Caleb finally placed his fork down and looked directly at her. Miss Hale, he said calmly, your father tells me you are responsible for the design division at SkyLink. Rory nodded slightly. Lead structural engineer. Tristan raised his glass. So she actually builds the airplanes. Rory met his gaze. Someone has to. Tristan smiled faintly, but said nothing more. Caleb watched the exchange carefully before continuing. Your modular wing design, he said. The SkyLink A9 prototype. Rory was slightly surprised. You've read the reports. I read everything before making a decision. His tone remained completely neutral. The design reduces manufacturing cost by 14%. Rory corrected him automatically. 16 if production reaches full scale. Caleb's eyes held hers for a moment. Impressive. Tristan made a quiet clicking sound with his tongue. Listen to you too, he said, already flirting through engineering statistics. Arthur ignored him completely. Caleb's attention returned to Rory. You understand the position your company is currently in. It was not phrased as a question. Yes, Rory replied. Then you understand why this merger must happen quickly. Rory leaned back slightly in the chair. I understand why it benefits you. Caleb did not react to the challenge. It benefits both companies. You mean it prevents SkyLink from collapsing? Tristan chuckled softly. Direct. I like that. Caleb folded his hands on the table. Let's be clear, he said. Without this agreement, your company will default on its loans within 10 days. Rory did not flinch. I'm aware. And if that happens, Caleb continued, the creditors will dismantle SkyLink piece by piece. Manufacturing rights, patents, facilities, everything. Rory's voice remained calm. Yes. The room fell quiet again. Finally, Caleb asked the question that had been waiting in the air since she arrived. So the real issue is simple. His gaze remained steady. Are you willing to proceed with the marriage agreement? Tristan leaned forward slightly, clearly enjoying the moment. Arthur remained completely still. Rory looked from one man to the other before answering. Before I agree to marry someone, she said evenly, I would like to understand what kind of person he is. Tristan laughed openly. That's fair. Caleb did not smile. What exactly would you like to know? Rory met his eyes directly. Why you need this? For the first time, Caleb paused. Only briefly, but Rory noticed it. Your company needs the merger, he said. But the marriage condition isn't necessary for the business structure. Rory continued watching him. So the question remains. Caleb exhaled slowly. 3 weeks ago, he said, my brother created a situation that attracted a significant amount of media attention. Tristan raised his glass again. I prefer the term legendary incident. Caleb ignored him. Several board members became concerned about instability inside the company. Rory understood immediately. They think the family is divided. Correct. Arthur nodded slightly. A marriage alliance demonstrates unity between two corporate dynasties, he added. Investors respond well to that. Tristan leaned sideways toward Rory. Translation, he said quietly. Wall Street loves a good royal wedding. Rory looked back at Caleb. And you're willing to marry a stranger to stabilize your stock price? Caleb answered without hesitation. Yes. There was no drama in the answer. Just simple certainty. Rory studied him carefully now. Most people would have softened the statement, hidden it behind diplomacy or charm. Caleb Galloway did neither. He treated the situation like a contract. Honesty is efficient, he added. I don't see a reason to pretend otherwise. Tristan clapped slowly. Look at that, he said. Romance in its purest form. Rory ignored him and turned back to Caleb. If this marriage happens, she said calmly, I assume there will be legal conditions. Arthur spoke first. A prenuptial agreement. Tristan leaned back in his chair again. Of course there is. Caleb's voice remained steady. The contract protects both companies. Rory asked the next obvious question. And if the marriage ends? Caleb's expression did not change. Then the companies remain merged. Tristan laughed again. See, he said, you're not a wife. You're a structural component. Rory met his gaze calmly. Then I'll make sure I'm the strongest one in the structure. Tristan watched her for a moment before smiling slowly. Interesting. Caleb stood from the table. The lawyers will bring the contract after dessert. Rory rose as well. Then I suppose we should read it. Tristan tilted his head slightly as he watched them. You two really are perfect for each other, he said lightly. Cold, logical, efficient. Caleb did not respond. But as Rory followed him toward the adjacent study where the documents waited, she felt something unexpected beneath the tension of the evening. Not trust. Not yet. But something close to recognition. Caleb Galloway was not pretending about anything. And that made him far more dangerous than she had expected. The study was smaller than the dining room, but equally imposing. Dark mahogany shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound books and framed photographs of airplanes and corporate milestones. A single desk sat in the center, perfectly organized, with a stack of papers waiting on one corner. Rory walked toward it cautiously, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. Caleb followed silently, his presence like a shadow she could not ignore. Arthur lingered near the doorway, arms crossed, while Tristan leaned casually against a bookshelf, smirking as if he were already the audience to a play he had written. Caleb picked up the top document and held it in front of Rory. "Prenuptial agreement," he said simply. "Terms are straightforward. Protection for both parties and the companies. Standard clauses for property, stock, and operational control." Rory took the papers carefully and skimmed the first few pages. Legal language was precise but merciless. Every possible scenario had been accounted for. "And your lawyers prepared this?" she asked. "Yes." Caleb's voice was neutral. "They've cross-referenced SkyLink's existing liabilities, and the agreement ensures the merger remains binding even if the marriage ends prematurely." Rory paused, reading a clause that clearly stated her personal assets would be legally separate from corporate holdings. "So legally, this is all about controlling the companies, not the people." Caleb nodded. "Correct. It's a business solution." Tristan snorted softly. "Business and romance have never been the same thing," he said. Rory ignored him and continued reading. Each clause reinforced the stark reality. Her autonomy was protected, but her presence in this arrangement was crucial for the investor's confidence. "And you," she said finally, looking up at Caleb, "how do you feel about this arrangement personally?" Caleb studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "Emotionally irrelevant," he said finally. "Practically necessary." Rory let the statement settle. It was concise, precise, true, more than anyone she had met in a long time. "Then I suppose our first negotiation is over," she said flatly, handing the papers back. Caleb placed them carefully on the desk. "For now," Arthur finally spoke. "Dinner is concluded. Lawyers will finalize the document tomorrow morning." Tristan tilted his head toward Rory. "You're quite the strategist, aren't you?" Rory raised an eyebrow. "I've been trained to assess risk and opportunity. I apply the same rules to everything." Tristan smiled faintly, leaning back further. "Good. You're not easily intimidated." Rory gave nothing more than a neutral nod. Caleb turned toward the door. "We'll continue this conversation tomorrow at the estate." Full board review. Rory followed him, Arthur bringing up the rear. Tristan lingered, watching her carefully, eyes sharp with amusement. Rory exited into the hall, feeling the quiet weight of the evening pressing down on her. She had faced difficult decisions before, but this was different. Every word, every action, every glance in that room had carried meaning far beyond casual conversation. For the first time, she understood that saving SkyLink would require more than engineering skill. It would require navigating human motives sharper than any metal she had ever forged. Outside, the Atlantic wind swept against the estate windows. Rory closed her coat tightly around her and looked at the fading sky. Tomorrow, she knew, she would meet not just a man, but an entire set of expectations that might determine the survival of a company, her family's legacy, and her own life. And for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of something she could not quantify: anticipation. But it was tempered by calculation. She would not act without knowing the full structure of the challenge in front of her. Inside the estate, Caleb Galloway returned to the study, Tristan already leaning against the wall, smirking. "She's sharper than I thought," Tristan said softly. Caleb's eyes remained fixed on the desk. "That is exactly why this will work," he said quietly. Tristan tilted his head. "Or exactly why it could fail." Caleb's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we ensure it doesn't." And with that, the first day of an arrangement that would change everything came to a quiet, taut close. The next morning dawned gray over the Hamptons, a light drizzle streaking the windows of the estate. Rory sat at a small breakfast table, coffee in hand, scanning the documents once more. Every clause, every subclause, had been read and reread. The legal language was tight, unyielding, and entirely devoid of sentiment. She appreciated that. Emotion made mistakes, logic prevented them. A soft knock interrupted her focus. "Enter," she said without looking up. Caleb stepped inside, his expression neutral, holding a cup of coffee. "Morning," he said simply. Rory gestured to the chair opposite her. Sit. You're early. I prefer to be punctual, he replied. He sat, placing the cup carefully on the table, and folded his hands. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but charged. Rory broke it. You're calm about this. Caleb's eyes met hers. I have no reason to panic. The numbers are clear. The agreement is precise. All variables accounted for. Rory tilted her head. Do you always speak like this? Always, he said. Efficiency dictates clarity. Ambiguity is costly. Rory nodded slowly. I can respect that. Tristan's voice rang from the doorway. I can't. It's boring. Rory looked up. Tristan leaned against the frame, smirking. Seriously, you two could talk in spreadsheets and still look dramatic. Caleb's expression did not change. Tristan, he said flatly. This isn't a performance. Tristan laughed softly. Relax. I'm just observing history in the making. Rory ignored him, focusing on Caleb. Then let's address the critical points. She spread the documents across the table. Stock allocations, operational control, and board responsibilities. I want clarity. Caleb leaned forward, hands on the table. Everything has been outlined. SkyLink retains operational independence for 6 months post-merger. After that, integration committees are formed with equal representation. Rory read aloud the key paragraph. And my authority during that period? Caleb's lips pressed into a thin line. Final say on engineering and design. Financial decisions require joint approval. Tristan whistled softly. Look at you. Already mapping the chain of command. Rory ignored him. Caleb continued. Prenuptial protects your personal assets. No individual liabilities cross to Galloway Corporation. Any disputes go to arbitration. Rory studied him carefully. You've anticipated every scenario. Caleb nodded. Efficiency demands foresight. Surprises are costly. Rory leaned back in her chair, absorbing the information. Then she asked the question she had rehearsed in her mind since arriving. And your brother? Caleb's eyes darkened slightly. Tristan has tendencies. He enjoys creating chaos. That is why we keep him observed. Rory's gaze flicked to Tristan, who smirked openly. I see. So part of my role is managing family interference. Caleb's lips twitched faintly, almost imperceptibly. Partly. But your focus should remain on the company and the merger. Personal distractions are secondary. Rory noted the precision in his phrasing. Secondary, not irrelevant. Caleb inclined his head. Exactly. Never irrelevant. Arthur appeared at the door, signaling the lawyers had arrived with the final contract. Rory gathered the papers and glanced at Caleb. Shall we finalize this? He nodded once. Yes. For the next hour, signatures were placed with clinical precision. No hesitation, no theatrics. Each name etched a new line in the future of 2 corporations and 1 forced alliance. Rory handed the pen back, the last signature dry on the paper. Caleb folded the documents carefully and placed them in a folder. The merger is legally binding, he said. The marriage agreement is in effect immediately for signaling purposes to stakeholders. Personal terms remain private. Rory nodded, her expression unreadable. Tristan clapped once, mockingly enthusiastic. Congratulations. You're officially part of corporate history, and possibly part of a corporate romance, he teased. Rory met his gaze coolly. I am part of the merger. Nothing more. Tristan's smirk faltered slightly. We'll see, he said, and left the room with a faint laugh. Caleb's phone vibrated on the table, a secure line. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. Tristan didn't just go to the board. He went to the lead underwriter at Sterling Bank, the one holding SkyLink's debt. He leaked the espionage file anonymously, triggering a mandatory Know Your Customer fraud alert. The bank didn't need a court order. They simply invoked the moral turpitude clause in the credit agreement. The funding is frozen at the source, Rory. They've classified the merger assets as high-risk collateral. He isn't just delaying us. He's forced the bank to pull the plug on the $350 million payment until a full third-party forensic audit is completed. An audit that will take weeks, time we don't have. He looked up, his gaze locking onto hers with lethal intensity. You understand the stakes now. This is no longer just a signaling exercise. Your actions in the next 72 hours will determine if SkyLink survives the week. Rory's voice was quiet but firm. I understand, and I intend to ensure it does. Caleb inclined his head slightly. Good. Then we begin. Outside. The Atlantic wind pressed against the estate, carrying with it the sense of urgency that had begun the moment Rory stepped into the Hamptons. Inside, two individuals, both calculating, both precise, prepared to navigate the pressures of corporate survival, public scrutiny, and family intrigue. And somewhere in the quiet tension of the room, Rory realized the real challenge was only beginning. The evening's formal event at the Metropolitan Museum was less about art than optics. Hundreds of high-profile guests moved through the grand halls, champagne flutes in hand, cameras flashing at every corner. Rory adjusted her evening gown, feeling its weight and the subtle stiffness of a dress she would never have chosen for herself, and followed Caleb through the crowd. Their movements were synchronized, deliberate, and completely rehearsed. To every outside observer, they were the perfect couple, poised, elegant, and smiling on cue. But beneath the surface, every gesture was a calculation, every glance a test. Reporters hovered near the steps of the museum's grand staircase, microphones extended, flashes firing in rapid succession. A journalist approached, eyes sharp, voice slightly accusatory. "Mr. Galloway, what does this merger signal for the aviation industry?" Caleb's response was calm, measured. It signals stability and a long-term commitment to innovation. Rory could see the next question forming in the journalist's mind. She anticipated it and leaned slightly toward Caleb, speaking with quiet precision. "SkyLink will continue independent research initiatives, ensuring regional aircraft designs remain competitive." The journalist blinked, taken slightly off guard. "And Miss Hale, with the personal alliance, how does that impact decision-making?" Rory's voice remained neutral, steady. "The personal arrangement does not influence operational decisions. The merger is structured to ensure clear corporate governance." Caleb's eyes flicked to her, a brief trace of approval visible. They moved through the crowd, cameras snapping from all angles, smiles never faltering. Rory noted subtle nods from investors, their expressions relaxed now that the perfect couple narrative had been established. Then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed Tristan leaning casually against a column, watching her closely. His grin was faint but unmistakable. He was observing her, looking for any crack in her composure. Rory ignored him, continuing her role with precise poise. Caleb's hand brushed against hers briefly as they approached the main gallery. It was minimal, controlled. The gesture did not betray intimacy. It confirmed coordination. She felt the tension beneath the polite smiles and elegant surroundings. Each movement in the public eye carried consequences. Each misstep could be used against them. And Tristan would seize any opportunity. A waiter approached, offering hors d'oeuvres, and Rory took one mechanically, eyes scanning the room for subtle reactions. Caleb spoke softly. "You are handling this well." Rory kept her voice low but firm. "This is a performance. The audience is never the only one watching." Caleb nodded once, his gaze sharp. "Exactly. And the backstage is just as important." Rory understood immediately. He was not referring to the crowd. He meant Tristan, the board, the internal pressures yet unseen. She made a mental note to track every interaction, every small gesture, every implication. Their path forward required precision beyond engineering. A subtle comment from a journalist about SkyLink's recent design delays triggered a quick, measured rebuttal from Rory. Caleb's eyes flicked to her in surprise. She had intercepted the question and neutralized it before it became a narrative. Tristan's smirk faded slightly. He was watching now, calculating, realizing Rory was not simply playing along. She was controlling the narrative quietly, efficiently, and ruthlessly. The evening stretched into hours, each public appearance a meticulous test of endurance and composure. By the time they exited into the cool night air, Rory felt the weight of hundreds of eyes having observed her, assessed her. Caleb walked beside her silently, his posture relaxed yet vigilant. "You were impressive," he said quietly. Rory's lips pressed into a straight line. "I was professional." Caleb's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, but more than that. You were effective." Rory looked at him briefly, but said nothing. The cool Atlantic wind blew against them as the car waited outside. Tristan lingered in the doorway, his grin returning. "Not bad," he called after them. "Not bad at all." Rory ignored him, stepping into the car. Caleb followed. The doors closed with a soft click. Inside, The quiet hum of the engine and the low murmur of the rain against the windows reminded her that while the cameras were gone, the real work had only begun. And tomorrow, she knew, Tristan would escalate the game. The public display had one perception, but the unseen threats, internal sabotage, and family intrigue were still waiting. Rory braced herself. The performance had been successful, but the war had just begun. The calm of the drive back from the museum was deceptive. Rory sat in the back seat, reviewing mental notes from the evening. Caleb was silent beside her, his gaze fixed forward, precise, unyielding. She sensed him analyzing the same threats she had cataloged: Tristan's subtle provocations, investor reactions, boardroom murmurs, and media angles. By the time they arrived at the estate, night had settled over the Hamptons, rain streaking the driveway in thin, silver lines. Rory stepped out first, heels clicking against the stone. Caleb followed, the distance between them measured, professional. Inside, the house was quiet. Tristan had retreated, Arthur was reviewing financial statements in his study, and the lawyers had already left. Rory set her coat on the rack, tension coiling in her shoulders. Caleb approached, voice low. Tonight was about optics. Tomorrow will be about reality. Rory nodded slightly. I know. The performance is over. Now we deal with internal threats. Caleb tilted his head, acknowledging her precision. Exactly. You anticipate Tristan's moves. Already cataloging patterns. He's aggressive, opportunistic, and thrives on creating public perception of instability. He will target weaknesses, both personal and corporate. Caleb's expression remained controlled, but a faint trace of approval appeared. Good. That insight will be useful. Rory walked toward the library, opening a chair and sitting down with a sigh. I have a question, she said, about your brother. Caleb leaned against the doorway. Go on. How much of Tristan's behavior is independent, and how much is directed? Caleb's eyes darkened slightly. He has influence, but he is not a puppet. He acts for amusement, and occasionally to test loyalty within the company. Rory folded her hands. So he's unpredictable. Caleb nodded. To a degree. But patterns exist, and we exploit them. Rory considered the words, the calculated control in Caleb's tone. And if he escalates beyond amusement? Caleb stepped closer. Then we take measures before damage is done. Containment is always an option. Rory's gaze held his. Containment, not confrontation. Caleb's lips pressed into a thin line. Confrontation without strategy is reckless. We act where the advantage is certain. Rory understood instantly. Every move, every counter, would have to be premeditated, calculated, precise. No emotion, no impulsive reactions. The room felt colder than before, heavy with unspoken understanding. Arthur finally stepped inside. I've reviewed the accounts, he said. Everything is ready for the integration plan once the merger is public. Rory looked up at her father. Integration plan? Yes, he said. Departments, stock allocations, patents. The moment the merger is formal, the committees are established. You will have direct oversight over engineering and design decisions immediately. Rory nodded. Understood. Caleb glanced at her, eyes sharp. And you're ready for this? Rory met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, I won't fail. He inclined his head slightly. Good. Then we begin tomorrow. With precision. Tristan's voice echoed from the upper hall, light and teasing. Precision, huh? We'll see how long that lasts. Rory ignored the interruption. Caleb remained silent, watching her quietly. The tension in the house had shifted subtly. It was no longer just public perception. Now, the battle was internal, strategy, control, subtle sabotage, and observation. Rory felt it pressing down on her like steel. The game had truly begun, and she would play it with exacting calculation, leaving nothing to chance. 2 days later, the first sign of real trouble arrived quietly, but with immediate impact. Rory was reviewing SkyLink's operational logs on her tablet when an alert popped up. Unusual activity in the internal design servers. At first, she assumed it was a routine system glitch. But the timestamps were off. Files had been accessed and copied overnight. Engineering schematics, proprietary designs, confidential project notes. Her stomach tightened. Someone had breached security. The breach wasn't a standard hack. It was an exploitation of the master override protocol, a high-level emergency access designed only for catastrophic system failures. By using her father's encrypted key, Tristan didn't just bypass the firewall. He triggered a massive, automated data mirroring process that the system mistook for a legitimate backup procedure. Rory watched the logs in cold fury. The A9's structural stress test models, the fuel efficiency algorithms, and the turbine housing specs hadn't been copied. They had been migrated to an off-site, untraceable cloud server. Tristan hadn't just stolen the designs. He had effectively locked her out of her own active development environment, leaving her with corrupted local fragments while he held the only functional copies of the A9's final certification data. By the afternoon, she had a working strategy. Then she heard the sound she had been dreading, the faint ping of a new message on her personal email. A short video file. She opened it, and her blood ran cold. The video wasn't just a trip down memory lane. It was a deep fake of a financial audit. Alongside the old university schematics, Tristan had spliced in screenshots of recent offshore wire transfers, totaling $6 million, flowing from a shell company linked to SkyLink's primary European competitor directly into a dormant trust account under Rory's name. Rory stared at the screen, her pulse hammering. It was a surgical frame-up. By anchoring the fake bank records to her real, decade-old research collaboration, Tristan had created a narrative that wasn't just suspicious. It looked like a long-term, activated sleeper cell operation. To the Galloway board, this wasn't an academic overlap. It was a smoking gun of active industrial espionage, timed perfectly to trigger the bad faith clause in the merger contract. She turned to Caleb, who had arrived silently beside her. "It's him. Tristan," she said, voice measured. Caleb watched the screen briefly, then spoke, calm and precise. "He wants the merger delayed, to create doubt among the board and investors. He's counting on the narrative that SkyLink is unstable and that you are compromised." Rory nodded, her mind already racing through options. "We need a controlled disclosure. Deny, redirect, and isolate. Then identify who assisted him internally." Caleb's gaze sharpened. "Agreed. We also need a cover operation to protect perception. Investors must remain confident." Rory exhaled slowly. "Then we act together, as planned. No hesitation." Caleb's lips pressed into a thin line. "Exactly. And Rory," she looked up at him. "Yes. We cannot let him think he wins." Tristan's laughter echoed faintly through the halls as they began executing their strategy. Outside, the Atlantic wind carried the sense of storm that mirrored the one brewing inside the Galloway estate. But for the first time, Rory felt a dangerous exhilaration. The game had escalated, and she was no longer merely a participant. She was a strategist, and she intended to win. By the following morning, Rory knew that hiding was no longer enough. The breach had triggered whispers across the corporate network, and although no external media had yet seen the leaked files, the internal rumor mill was already spinning. Caleb, who had spent the night analyzing patterns of the attack, approached her with quiet intensity. "We need to remove you from immediate exposure," he said. "Temporary relocation. Control the environment." Rory arched an eyebrow. "You mean hide me?" Caleb's eyes did not waver. "Protect you, and prevent Tristan from gaining leverage." Without hesitation, Rory agreed. She packed essentials, laptop, tablet, encrypted drives, while Caleb coordinated discreet transportation. Within hours, they were en route to the Galloway family's private mountain estate in Aspen. The drive north was silent, the car's tires slicing through the early morning snow. Rory watched the white landscape flash past the windows, feeling the tension of recent days pressing down. "You trust no one here?" she asked quietly. Caleb's gaze stayed forward. "Not yet. Only you and me." Rory absorbed that, noting the rare clarity of his words. At the estate, the mountain winds were harsh, rattling the edges of the house. Inside, a fire burned in the large stone hearth, warmth contrasting the chill from outside. Rory glanced around. Minimalist furnishings, every object deliberately placed. No distractions, no vulnerabilities. Caleb broke the silence first. "We need to map out every potential vector Tristan could use from here. Communication lines, access points, staff." Rory nodded, already opening her tablet to begin a full audit. "Internal leaks, hidden cameras, remote access points. We assume he will escalate." Caleb moved to stand near the window, his posture rigid yet contemplative. "And if he moves beyond digital attacks?" Rory met his eyes, cold and precise. Then we respond with calculated measures. Always anticipate the outcome before acting. By midday, Rory discovered the source of the breach, but the reality was more twisted than simple negligence. The credentials used were indeed her father's, but they had been triggered by an automated script embedded in a series of frantic, outgoing emails. Rory stared at the decrypted attachments, documents showing that 2 years ago, Arthur had illegally diverted $40 million from the employee pension fund to cover SkyLink's initial research deficits. He hadn't been trying to destroy the company. He'd been trying to keep the lights on during the A9's development phase. The merger wasn't just a survival tactic, it was his exit strategy. Part of the Galloway agreement included a day-one capital injection for infrastructure upgrades. Arthur's plan was to use that cash to silently replenish the pension fund before the post-merger audit teams arrived. But Tristan had found the gap first. He wasn't just holding a prison sentence over Arthur's head. He was holding the reset button on the only plan Arthur had to fix his crime. To save his skin, Arthur had to give Tristan the master override to Rory's life work. By evening, exhaustion pressed against both of them, but the real breakthrough came during a rare moment of quiet in the kitchen. Snow fell heavily outside, and with no staff present, they were forced to prepare a simple dinner together. Rory chopped vegetables, while Caleb monitored the fire and organized the ingredients. It was a mundane task, but conversation inevitably turned from logistics to personal history. "Why do you stay so controlled?" Rory asked casually, slicing carrots with precision. Caleb glanced at her. "Because control prevents mistakes. It protects people, companies, and outcomes." Rory considered the answer. "Even yourself?" Caleb paused briefly, then nodded. "Especially myself. Emotions cloud judgment. They cost lives, or in our case, companies." Rory smiled faintly. "So that's why you appear cold. Not because you are incapable of warmth." Caleb's eyes met hers, neutral but unflinching. "Correct." The simple honesty caught Rory off guard, but she quickly masked any reaction. Their conversation shifted back to strategy, but the subtle human connection had been made. She now understood why Caleb was as effective as he was. His precision extended not only to business, but also to understanding people, just enough to anticipate moves before they happened. Outside, the wind howled against the mountain peaks, snow piling silently. Inside, two people, forced together by corporate necessity, found an uneasy rhythm in both strategy and quiet human acknowledgement. They had not yet admitted trust, and certainly not alliance, but the first threads were forming. And as night fell over the mountain estate, Rory realized something she had not expected. She was no longer simply a survivor in this corporate war. She was an active participant, and together, they would turn the tide against Tristan's chaos.